Hi, welcome everybody to this episode of the Carer Project podcast series. In this series we're talking about what we found in a really big research project that's all about care and mental health. And today's episode we're concentrating on the Carer Review Advisory Panel recommendations. My name is Christine and today we've got Jackie with us. Hi Jackie.
Hello.
We've got Gun.
Hiya.
And we've got Tracy.
Hello.
And yeah, as I say, we're going to discuss the Care Review Advisory Panel, talk a little bit about what actually that advisory panel is, and then we're going to talk about the recommendations that they came up with on the back of the information that we found in this project. So, Gun, before we really get going, do you want to tell us a little bit more about exactly what this project was about and what we aim to find out?
Yeah, so the background to the project is that we know that family members and friends play a really important role in supporting someone who is nearing the end of their life, in terms of both physical, emotional, practical support. But we also know that these family members or friends, whom I'm going to call carers, these carers also suffer quite considerable impact on their mental health. Often because of caregiving, that is, it entails anxiety, depression, distress and so on. And so the point of this project was to look at, okay, what are the factors or things that make carers' mental health worse or makes it better, with the aim to find out, how can we improve things for carers. So we wanted to gather all the evidence of what was known about what impacts on carers' mental health during end-of-life caregiving, and then summarize that in such a way that stakeholders, that is carers themselves or health and social care practitioners or policymakers, could make sense of that evidence and also make use of that evidence to look at how they could improve things for carers.
Okay, great, thank you. So, Tracy, do you want to briefly introduce the concept of what we call the RAP? So, as mentioned before, the Review Advisory Panel, or the RAPers. Just who is this Review Advisory Panel?
So it is a group of carers who would give advice on specific questions from us as researchers in terms of the evidence we found. Really to check and to ensure that it reflected with the real life experiences of carers.
Okay. And how did that project come about? How did the Review Advisory Panel come together? So I know we already had Jackie on board because we met Jackie right back before we got funding for this project, and she's been on board sort of from the year dot. But how did we enlist other people? How many people were on this panel?
So we have 5 carers on the panel and Jackie as our chair, so 6 carers. And we basically recruited through carer organisations. That was sort of the key way that we did that. And Jackie, there was a couple of people, wasn't there, on the carer panel that you also recruited or had worked with?
Did you strong arm people into this, Jackie?
No. There were 1 or 2 people I knew who had been carers, who had very strong views about things that could be improved. Not so much just around treatment for their loved one, but around how they as carers were dealt with within the system. And I felt rather than leave them moaning in life, we should bring them to an arena where they could bring their experience with a group, all of whom had cared for different people with different illnesses, different stages of illness. We had carers who'd looked after people for a number of years. We had one member who'd had a very acute experience. She'd only looked after somebody for about a month, but to bring their views to bear and make the project in a way less sterile, because we looked at everything through the lens of real life experience. And we were pleased that the researchers we were working with felt that was of great value, and our carer members got a number of benefits out of it. We could go through those again, and we will. But,
Yeah, it was absolutely huge value to us. on the research project as researchers to hear and to get the feedback from from carers and their experiences was so key.
So I know originally we had set outputs and aims and objectives that we wanted to achieve from this project. And if I remember rightly, I don't think a set of recommendations from the review advising panel was necessarily one of them.
No.
Everyone's laughing now and shaking their heads. So how on earth did that come about? Who wants to take up that story?
I think it was something that the carers themselves on our review panel felt very strongly about. I think it was lay people quite like very practical considerations. So to them research reports are very nice, but you show me something that will change somebody's life. And that I recall in the early days saying to Gunn, I'd really like something to happen here that just doesn't produce a good paper for peer review, but might have the potential to make a carer's life better. And I think that's why the panel were very keen on that. They didn't want them as add-ons, they wanted them as integrated into the project, and I think we've prevailed upon our researcher colleagues and you were amenable to letting us do that.
It just grew and grew, didn't it, really? Because I think, like you say, that our carers really wanted to sort of use the information that we had to make a difference, real difference to carers' lives. And we sort of started off by doing a few recommendations, didn't we? Sort of some general ones. But then the group were really keen to go into more detail and make like you say, a sort of really integrated part of the research project. These more detailed recommendations, and actually wanted to do an extra meeting, didn't they? Because I think originally we were looking at our RAP. We were looking at 6 meetings that they'd agreed, that to do and to be involved in. But actually we ended up with 9 because carers were looking at being trained in looking at sort of the findings and how to analyse findings of other sort of the evidence, we call it, in terms of other carers' stories and experiences and what had been found. And then obviously we had a whole session on purely on developing recommendations.
Yeah, and I think they were very keen to explore context. I think that was important to them, that you just didn't have a list that you could tick off. With each of the recommendations, there's a whole background and a context. How does that arise? Why is that important? Why would it make any difference? And it was really important to the carers that they conveyed to the researchers why they felt the way they did, and it was a product of their life experience. So it really enriched the project, I thought.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you were saying, like we obviously looked at developing recommendations, what might help carers, but also the carers' journey as well, in terms of looking at how they got to those recommendations, which was based on the evidence and then bringing in their experiences to develop them. And we have that within the recommendations, sort of that context, isn't it? That sort of setting of how carers came about making them, because it's quite challenging, wasn't it? I can imagine, to sort of at times, and complex in terms of making them. It wasn't necessarily straightforward. I think
on occasion, faced with the findings, which are irrefutable because they were factual, then to try and see that through the lens of real life experience and make sense of it. I think sometimes it was around vocabulary. So if you think when we came to identify themes, the carers actually wanted to rename them because they saw it in a different light. I think that was very valuable.
Absolutely.
But also made the carers feel very valued in the project. They didn't feel like an add-on, they felt an integral part of it, they felt influential, and that the project had the potential to actually improve carers' lives. I think for many of them it was cathartic work. I think some of them have never discussed their experiences before, and I think some felt they were giving something back. And we had mentioned on a number of occasions, I wouldn't like somebody else to go through what I went through. So by doing this thing I'm doing, I will help with that.
So what can you sort of summarise for us, Tracy or Jackie? What were some of these recommendations and what came out in the end?
So we had 6 overarching recommendations. So Jackie, is it okay if I give the sort of the summary of
Definitely.
the overarching, and then you to chip in for more of the details?
Well, because sometimes it's just a bit of elaboration round it, isn't it?
Yeah,
but
sure.
I don't think we would argue with you what the recommendations were. It's perhaps what did we mean by them.
That would be better not argue what they are. They're cemented now. They're on the website. Behave.
You can't organise blame input. I'm afraid it's like herding cats.
So we had 6 overarching recommendations. recommendations which the carers felt were really important in terms of implementing to make a difference to carers' lives. And the first one really was around awareness raising of the carers' situation. And so that's recommending really that carers are made aware of the support services that are available to them, and that health professionals are made aware of the need to address the impact of end-of-life caregiving on carers.
And I think, just to add there, it's really important because carers self-identify.
Yeah.
Until a carer self-identifies as a carer, there is no access to anything. And to be fair to the kind of authorities, they have no way of knowing what you need. So I think that was one of the things that came out very strongly for me. And you could be anybody. You could be related, you could be a family member, you could be a next door neighbour, you could be somebody that seemed a bit distant. But as long as you were a non-professional, unremunerated carer, you fit into our category.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thanks, Jackie. So the second one, really, I mean, there's no priority here, is there? These are just recommendations, so just to make that point. A roadmap to support carers to navigate the end-of-life caregiving journey or process, and that this contains really all the relevant information to support carers to navigate their way through each stage of the process.
Definitely.
That really came out strongly, didn't it?
Because it's so diverse, there are so many places to go to, and when your time's limited, because mostly it's taken up looking after somebody, you just don't have the time to search.
And to know also sort of to prepare as well, isn't it? And know what to be able to do in advance, and you know, rather than just wait until you get to a certain sort of part or process, thinking, well, what am I expecting here as well?
Well, that brings on a lot of emotional insecurity, because your desire is always to do your best for the person you're caring for. But if you feel there are signs I'm not recognising, there are things I'm not doing, you kind of want that prod. I remember my own husband died of cancer a number of years ago now, and I am quite a boring person. I like to read about experiences in a book to vindicate them. I don't like just living through them. And I used to actually say to the nursing staff, they'd say, oh, you know, probably not got long. Tell me why he's not got long. How do you know he's not got long? And subsequent to that, after he died, I don't know if it was partly as a result of me pestering, they actually produced a little booklet called Signs of the End of Life. And they hadn't produced one at that hospice before. So I thought it might help other people who might be, you know, very kind of keen to identify. You're scared of missing something. When you know you're going to lose somebody, you want to keep every bit of them. And you're kind of frightened that you've missed a sign. And our carers expressed this in very many ways. Interestingly, I felt some of the male members of the group were very keen that they'd not done as many practical things as they felt they could have done. Take somebody somewhere and get something for them. I felt our female members were a bit less worried about that and more in touch with did I sense the things correctly? So I don't know whether that was just coming from me, you know, whether I read that in, but certainly the examples they gave, which is all we can really go by, fell into those categories.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Yeah.
I mean, you know, it's not hard and fast, but I can think of David and Tony saying very, very practical things. I took them somewhere, but I can hear some of the female members saying, I sensed it was this, I could have done with that, it would have felt better.
Yes.
So it may just be the way men and women express differently, or it may be that they perceive the experience differently.
Thank you. Okay, so also the carers, what they felt really strongly about was about having bespoke support which recognises carers' needs and identifies them through assessment. So by needs, it's recognising that carers have individual needs, and this could be medical, personal and social needs. So it's a holistic way of looking at identifying carers' needs and then assessing them, making sure that they're assessed.
And we did recognise how impossible that is. You know, really, there isn't the time, the resource, the expertise to give everybody bespoke care. But we felt as much as you were able, we should aspire to it, really. Sounds like we're asking for miracles, doesn't it?
It's like what I sense as well is it's about taking these recommendations that are sort of overarching, but then tailoring them to carers' experiences, their individual experiences and needs.
Definitely.
And carers also talked about and recommended that there's an assessment of the patient's actual needs as well. So it's their patient's needs rather than their managed needs, if that makes sense. And this is about making visible the carer's input and what they do for the person that they're looking after. So taking into account the carer's support. So for example, things like maybe if a carer's doing the shopping or something like that, that's taken into account, that's sort of.
That was such an important and powerful point. I was in that meeting, I think, when that came out, and I was really struck by that. Because it's as you say, and I remember at the time, Jackie, it's, I remember who said it as well, when they do the assessment, well, shopping's taken care of, and you're like, but it's only taken care of because of that carer, and if that carer cannot do that task, it's actually not taken care of. And so it's really important that you do that functional assessment. What is the actual need, not what is being covered by this help that people give freely and happily, but if they are broken by this experience, if their mental health or physical health gets so bad that they can't do it, who needs to step in? And that really struck with me. And again, that's why it's so great to have this input from people who've lived it and experienced it, because I don't think I would have spotted that.
I think even support that's on offer is to a large extent, perhaps understandably so, fairly regimented, because it's got to be one size fits all with a little bit of tailoring. Whereas really our carers were explaining that if there could be a little bit more attention given to that, it would make an amazing difference. So that did come over very powerfully.
Yeah, it was a really strong point, wasn't it? And also our carer rep also recommended coordinated and timely care. That was really key, wasn't it? Through the provision of a single point of contact for the carer, so they have one point really that they're able to go to find out about the process, and rather than actually sort of disjointed, really, wasn't it?
That was still so incredibly important, and lots of years on, I'm still astonished that we don't do more on the holistic side. I remember, and it was echoed through our carers, this feeling that you went from pillar to post explaining your story to people, and when you're explaining something incredibly difficult or sad, do you want to keep reliving that every 5 minutes? Whereas if somebody had a file that, as it were, told your whole story, including your medical side, but not solely, that would be such a relief. You know, the frustration I heard in some of the members' voices about having to go and start again and ask the same questions, answer the same questions with a person who's really quite poorly, and you've got to keep asking them things, and you feel like saying, how many times do I need to tell them this? And I've heard this said amongst other areas with carers about people with mental health problems. I don't want to keep telling my story. I want my story to have been heard and recorded and accompany me wherever I go. I think that's so important, and yet it sounds so obvious, really, because you don't understand why you do have to replicate it.
And I think as well, not to underplay in any stretch the work and the advice that the RAP gave us, which we've absolutely loved and really benefited from, but that's something we've heard in other research projects as well. This is one of those that everybody is banging on about, and it comes out time and again, and it's come out again in this, and it's still not.
I'd really underline that, because I've heard it in other research groups, and in a way, ironically, the electronic patient record, which much has been made of, was, I think, partly put in place to try to get over this a bit. So when you didn't go to different clinicians, they could pull up your file. And I feel that that's working a little bit on the medical side. It's not taking account of the kind of emotional and social side. And to me, some of that needs to be worked into this.
So I think we've just got one more overarching theme left for the recommendations. What was that, Tracy?
And this really was what was considered to be fundamental by our carer rep, which was practical considerations, sort of essential resources, which includes meeting carers' basic physical needs, both during end-of-life caregiving and also post-bereavement. So, for example, the provision of sufficient finances, for example, in the form of a decent carer's allowance, and access to practical advice, for example, things like early legal and financial advice that were really key. And you said, didn't you, Jackie, all the way through,
and
that they were
incredibly
key.
sensitive. How can you ask a carer to do this most important task if they don't know where the next meal's coming from? And it's always amazed me throughout the years that this was such a basic thing, and really it seemed to be minimised. It's as that, and people are embarrassed to ask for help because they think they should ask for help for their patient, not for themselves. And if you don't know where your rent's coming from because you've had to give up work to become a carer, how are you going to be able to give decent care? And how is this going to reflect on your own mental health? Because you've got one set of worries through illness and another set of worries from practical day-to-day life. So I think, although that sounded quite a trite recommendation, to me it's always been underplayed, and I think it would actually bring a lot of relief to a lot of carers if they knew they had food on the table, rent paid, and could give all their best attention to looking after their patient.
Absolutely. I think that's just a powerful point to end on. I'm just sort of taking a pause there.
We're going to do a whip round now.
I know, you just think the amount of professional people who would have to take over that role of the carer and all those jobs. You have to think the cost benefit has got to be in favour of just giving a good carer's allowance. It's got to be cheaper to do that than to fund all these extra people who you would need to provide that care.
But it's just about money, is
No,
it?
no,
because
no.
there's the sensitivities around it. You know, if you're a partner caring for your loved one, do you want to reduce it to financial terms? No, you don't. If you're the next door neighbour who's inadvertently become a carer, does it feel mercenary to start talking about your reward for
And
it?
isn't that why it doesn't get mentioned enough though?
Because it's embarrassing.
Yeah, and because it's England, isn't it? I don't know if it's different in other
It's
countries,
difficult,
but absolutely, we don't talk about money here. And you
No,
know.
but it can be the difference between reasonable care and better care, and better mental health for the carer.
Absolutely. So, Jackie, I think you mentioned at the beginning that or maybe it was before we started recording, that we actually explained what these recommendations were and presented them to some stakeholder groups. So we had some policymakers and commissioners, we had some GPs, healthcare practitioners, and we had other carers as well. I don't know, Gunnar, if you want to chip in as well, but how did that go over? What did stakeholders, what did other people think about these recommendations? Did they seem valuable?
Yes, absolutely. So we did workshops with and focus groups with these other stakeholders, and we now had two really crucial bits of information to present to them. We had the research evidence that we summarised on the one hand, and we had these recommendations from the carer review advisory panel, and the stakeholders felt that all the information was valuable, but they felt that the recommendations were as important as the evidence, and sometimes more important than the evidence, because the recommendations, with those they could kind of see what the evidence means and what they need to focus on in terms of helping carers. And you were saying, Jackie, about the importance of having the recommendations validated by other carers who took part in the stakeholder workshops and groups.
I participated in a group with each of these policymakers, commissioners, GPs and carers. It was incredibly important to the review advisory panel that their recommendations were validated by the carer stakeholder group, because we weren't worth our salt if they couldn't see what we were saying, that we had common experience, we understood where they were coming from. So I think that was really important, and I think they did. They definitely did. I think the other two groups, I think their reaction was predictable, and that's not negative. The GPs obviously want to try to help their patients and their patients who are carers, but are probably a bit limited as to what they can do, because they're going to do certain things. But they did think the identification of carers and the kind of signposting to them might be quite helpful, and they did receive the recommendations well. I think the policymakers and the commissioners, because of the type of work they do, they really want things packaged up fairly concisely, because their answer is, what can we do for you? So it's no use saying, well, this is how I feel, and we don't know how you feel. We want a list, really. If you do these things, you will really help us. We know they might not all be affordable or practical, but as much energy as you can put into them, the better. And I think those people actually said, well, I'm glad you've given us something concrete to go at. So I thought they were incredibly useful groups, and you know, our review panel, I think, was very gratified that people didn't say, what's this rubbish, you know, oh, we recognise these things, we know these things. I suspect one of the things that workshops would be most surprised about is this financial thing, because it seems such an obvious thing. It's the more intricate and esoteric stuff that people think you're going to struggle with, because it's like, well, we know the money thing, just do that one.
Yeah.
But it was very important. So no, I thought it was really valuable work. I think the review panel was very gratified that people could identify with what we were suggesting, and it made us feel of incredible use, because you can see the value of a good research paper. But a group of carers who think what they've done is got together and had a really good talk about something to produce something practically useful is I don't know, it's sort of profound, really. It changed some of those people's lives, the idea that they could do something as material as that. So, and the kind of group of researchers, we were very lucky, who did appreciate the input from the lay carers. It wasn't taken for granted at all. You tried to tease out from us, what do you mean by that? You know, do we really understand what you're saying? And equally well, you took criticism reasonably well, when the carers would say, well, I don't know where you got that from, but you know, we're not having that one. And I found that's what made the research more real, and it was very integrated. You know, it wasn't kind of standalone, here's some papers and here's some people chatting. They really made a kind of coherent whole in the end.
We were a team, really, weren't we? We felt like a team in a way.
Well, we missed out on the cake, but we pretty much were a team.
It's probably fair to say we'd have given you cake, but
we
for
don't
anybody
have
listening
cake,
in the
but for
future,
but that's something else to comment on. The fact that we managed to keep that stakeholder group, the carer group, going throughout the pandemic, working largely remotely. There were people who didn't know each other, who physically met once, yet bonded as a group, were very different individuals, didn't always agree with each other, but we managed to get something very positive and productive out of it. So I thought and it was great to be a chair of a good group.
Well, I have to say, you definitely were a good group, and as we've all suggested and said, not only was it a good group, and you feel, or it comes across that you all feel like you've contributed something meaningful. I think as a group of researchers, we definitely feel that it's been of great value having you on board. And I think that's also reflected in the response that we've had from stakeholder groups, where they've really got a lot of benefit from hearing that carer voice, and really it resonates with them in terms of their own experiences of people that they've met, and it really brings it all to life and gives it a lot of impact. And for us, that's as much as we can ask for and more. That's really where we all want our research to go, is for it to be impactful.
We felt that like there was real partnership working, and the kind of PPE bit was never an add-on or a box ticking. We were at the centre of that research, which I think is very important. You know, this phrase about no research about me without me. Well, we were definitely in the middle of it as carers. So.
So I'm going to wrap up now. I'm just conscious we've been on nearly half an hour, so I don't know if people are getting bored of us straight on. I think that's been really interesting, and I was obviously a part of some of that. So I'll round that up now. So thank you so much, Jackie, for joining us. It's always really interesting to hear your perspective on anything and everything, frankly, but obviously we're doing this series, so interesting to hear your perspective on this. Gun and Tracy, thank you so much for summarising and contributing. As always with our podcast series, we are just giving summaries of what we found and what we did. If you want more information, there's a lot of information and some posters and all sorts of useful resources and big thick reports that you're going to love reading with lots of detail. So you can head to our website, or if you're on Twitter, go to Twitter @CarerProject and you'll be able to find the link on there. Thank you again for joining us today, and watch out for some other podcasts in our series which will explore all the different themes that we found from the research evidence that we were able to pull together. So from everybody here today, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.